Welcome to Impactology Live. It's for everyone that's joining us, thank you. We've been absolutely overwhelmed with the response with individuals joining the presentations. And this particular presentation, Rita, I must admit, I've been looking forward to this chat for a couple of reasons. We have got Mark Redding, who is the head of foundation at Atlassian. And I will explain why I've been looking forward to this conversation in particular. We've got an Aussie global tech firm that is making a significant impact on the world stage. But there's also the story of Mark Redding as well. So we're really looking forward to navigating through those two conversations there in terms of Mark's story and obviously the story of the Atlassian Foundation. Before we chat with Mark, what I'd like to do is just give a bit more of a background about Mark's story. So Mark brings a combination of extensive commercial and philanthropic experience. He joined Atlassian in 2016, following a successful 33-year career with PwC, including more than 20 years as a partner. Mark was PwC Australia's Corporate Responsibility Partner and a member of the PwC's Global Corporate Responsibility Board from 2011 to 2016. The Atlassian Foundation, they've become one of Australia's leading foundations because in the early days of the Atlassian, the two co-founders, Scott Farquhar and Mike Cannon-Brooks, pledged to use 1% of company equity profit, employee time and product to tackle social issues. The Atlassian Foundation focuses on two strategic goals, education and pledge 1%. We're going to get into those in a little more detail with Mark. Mark, welcome to Impactology.
Thank you very much, George, Rita. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you.
Thanks.
Now, as I mentioned, there's so many directions we'd like to go with this, but before we discuss your role with the Atlassian Foundation, you've got an amazing story yourself. And Rita and I, in doing our research and following our chat, our prep with yourself, we felt that we couldn't gloss over it and jump into the Atlassian Foundation story. So can you share with us your story prior to joining the Atlassian Foundation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly don't consider it an amazing story, but I'm happy to share it. So yeah, I spent 33 years with PwC. For most of that time, actually I spent some of that time in Australia, some time in Singapore, London, Indonesia and Thailand. So that was sort of where my career took me in terms of countries. For most of that time, I was a valuation and strategy specialist. And I was admitted as a valuation and strategy partner in '95 and had a number of leadership roles within PwC as a partner and sort of as my career progressed. Probably the most interesting part from the perspective of anybody who's listening in today would be sort of my transition out of my traditional client-facing role into the corporate responsibility partner role and then the subsequent sort of move across to Atlassian. PwC's had a long-standing commitment to trying to use its resources for good and does some really great stuff. I guess as a partner, I was one of the partners who was one of the more proactive supporters of all of the work being done through the PwC Foundation and the like. In about 2010, I guess it was, the previous corporate responsibility partner, a guy by the name of Rick Millen, decided it was time to retire from the partnership, and he tapped on the shoulder. I think it was probably about a dozen partners within PwC who he thought would be sort of natural potential successors, given their sort of long-standing commitment to the foundation. I was one of those partners, and so we were all asked to think about whether or not we wanted to move into the role as the corporate responsibility partner, which was a pretty significant role. You spent more than half your time in that capacity, so it would mean giving up the majority of your client-facing activity and moving into a primary function, which was the corporate responsibility partner role. Personally, I went through a period of, 3-4 months, perhaps, of serious self-reflection, introspection. There was a part of me that, surprisingly, meant that I actually defined myself as a person in terms of my professional career. If somebody had asked me beforehand, would you have any difficulty giving up your client-facing responsibilities and taking on a corporate responsibility partner role or any other role for that matter? I would have just said, no, of course not. If it was the right thing to do, I'd do it. But when push came to shove, and I was actually having to start thinking about it seriously, all of a sudden my ego kicked in. I started to worry about what my fellow partners would think of me. I had these deep fears that they would see me as moving out of the mainstream into a side stream, and I would lose some of the respect and the respect, I guess, of my fellow partners. And there were all sorts of fears and insecurities that kicked in. Anyhow, I guess over a period of 3 or 4 months, I had the opportunity to think about why it was that I was feeling the way I was, think about my ego and how it was driving my reaction and potential decision and behaviour, and fortunately, because frankly it's changed my life trajectory ever since. I had the courage to actually say, look, I really don't care what others think of me. At the end of the day, I know this would be the right role for me, and therefore I'm willing to put my hand up and formally interview for the role. And so I guess by the time that I did, because I'd been doing so much reflecting, I actually interviewed with a real passion, I think, and a real sense of clarity as to what I wanted to achieve in the role. And so I was lucky. I got the role. That was a massive life-changing event for me. So I switched to 40% client work and 60% corporate responsibility. And so I started the role in sort of like 2011. And I found that within probably 18 months to 2 years, this valuation and strategy work that I'd been doing for 27 years before then, and which had always been very satisfying and intellectually stimulating and, I'd loved, suddenly lost all of its sense of meaning and purpose. And I had very little motivation for my traditional client work. And I was finding that I was using all of my discretionary time to lead the corporate responsibility activities of PwC and to try and have as much impact as we possibly could. Not surprisingly, in that sort of situation, I stopped wearing out some of the shoe leather that you have to wear out in order to chase down new business, because the nature of the work I was doing was the jobs tended to last 4 to 6 weeks, and you had to be continually refreshing them with new jobs. And because I was losing my motivation, I sort of stopped chasing down the new jobs. My reputation in that field sort of diminished, so suddenly I found myself competing on price for some of that work, and hence the margins were dropping. And I found myself after probably 3 years responsibility partner role in a situation where I had to have a conversation with the partner to whom I reported, and we both faced up to the fact that I had lost my passion for my client work, and I was getting all of my motivation out of my corporate responsibility partner role, and I sort of couldn't continue not doing client work. So we agreed a transition plan, and that was spend 18 months just working 3 days a week in my corporate responsibility partner role, and at the end of those 18 months to retire from the partnership. I loved those 18 months. Working only 3 days a week is awesome. Working 3 days a week on social impact is even better, and doing it and getting paid 60% of a partner income is even better still. So it was a very good 18 months, but it came to an end, and that was the end of September 2016. And I just happened to get lucky, I guess. Atlassian went through an IPO in the second half of 2015. On the back of that IPO, the Atlassian Foundation, which had been gifted 1% of the shares in Atlassian, suddenly became a foundation that was pretty well endowed. And so Scott and Mike said, look, it's time to sort of recruit a head of the foundation, somebody who can help to take the foundation and the impact that we have to a higher level, commensurate with the increased liquid asset base of the foundation. Pledge 1% was always something that was important to Atlassian as well, which we'll talk more about shortly, I'm sure. Yep. But that's effectively, persuading or inspiring business founders to pledge, like Scott and Mike did, 1% of their equity, their profit, their time, or their product. And so the fact that I had a blend of commercial experience through my 33 years with PwC, and I had focused actually on the technology, media, and telecommunications sector. So I was used to working with founders of early stage businesses and things like that. And I had at that stage 6 years of social impact work, where PwC also focused on education, which was the focus area of the Atlassian Foundation. Just meant that I aligned with the Atlassian values. You don't get into Atlassian unless you are somebody who lives and breathes those Atlassian values. I happened to be the right person in the right place at the right time. And so I was offered the role, and I've absolutely loved it. I feel very, very privileged to be entrusted with custodianship of the resources of Atlassian and the Atlassian Foundation, and trying to put them to their very best use. So I didn't, if you'd asked me in 2010, where would I be in 2020? I certainly wouldn't have expected it to be here. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to that one decision that I took on the back of 3 or 4 months worth of serious reflection about who I am and what motivates me, and what I fear and why I fear it, and should I fear it, and all those sorts of things. So it's been a journey of self-discovery, as well as hopefully a journey of impact.
Mark, you mentioned the conversation with the partner in the first instance, the ego kicking in, and then you jumped to the time when you felt that you had that clarity and passion in the interview. Who did you draw on for advice in between that sort of initial ego shock and the interview to help you make that decision and be able to address the ego in the room and make sure that you could get the most out of that opportunity? Yeah.
To be honest, I didn't consult particularly widely. I think it was more of an internal journey. I certainly spoke to my wife at the time. She's now my former wife, but she and I definitely talked about it. We also had a situation in which, I don't want to go into the details because it's sort of private in relation to one of my sons, but one of my sons was really struggling, and I was attending some counselling sessions with him. And I did have an absolute moment of clarity, I guess, when I was sitting in a counselling session with him, and I suddenly realised that his counsellor was literally saving lives, and I was struggling with moving from one role within PwC to another role within PwC, and so I had this blinding flash of clarity, and I thought to myself, "You bloody idiot! Why on earth are you fearing this change? Put your head in and do what it is that you want to do."
Mark, what you're talking about there has been a theme over the last 2 days around the moving from a role where individuals identify themselves as, and being able to, the terminology has been shed the skin, I think is what people have been describing it. If there are executives or individuals that are going through that process and thinking about that, what words of advice would you provide them?
I certainly believe that in whatever you do, do the things that you find you're most passionate about. Do the things that you find give you energy and motivation. Whether that's in a professional capacity or a social impact capacity or any other capacity, because the things that you are passionate about tend to give you energy, tend to sort of result in you becoming, effectively a leader in that space, somebody that others find can provide some inspiration, and opportunities do tend to arise, but don't necessarily do it all in one jump. I mean, in some cases that's entirely appropriate. But for me, it was definitely a sort of an iterative journey. I spent, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years focused primarily upon my client work, but actively engaged with the PwC Foundation. I was definitely, heavily engaged with the foundation, but it was just something that I did because I wanted to, and it didn't have any meaningful impact upon any other aspect of my life. But because I'd spent that 7 or 8 years doing it, it created the opportunity where I was one of the people who was tapped on the shoulder. And then, I decided eventually to sort of do that. But even for me, then it was it felt like a really big risk at the time and a really big decision. But when I sit back and reflect, at the end of the day, it was moving from one role within a PwC partnership to another role within a PwC partnership. So it, in the big picture scheme of things, it wasn't a massive change. even though it felt like a massive change for me at the time. But again, because I followed my passion ultimately, that then created an opportunity to take on the role at Atlassian. If at any point along that pathway I had not been doing what I was doing, from the original work where I was just a sort of a passive, minor participant in the PwC Foundation, right through the entire journey. If at any point I'd not been doing those things, then I wouldn't be where I am today, and I wouldn't be getting the meaning and the purpose and the satisfaction, and hopefully having the impact that I'm having, or my team is having, all Atlassians and the organisations that we're partnering with are having, more importantly. So I'd just say, if something motivates you, if something gives you energy, gives you drive, if you've got passion for something, then find ways to bring that to life without necessarily trying to make one big fundamental change from direction X to 180-degree direction Y.
Yeah. And Mark, over that time as well, what skills did you find that you had to develop in your new role, even in terms of your own leadership style? And what were maybe some of the skills or even your approach to leadership that you thought, it served me well in the past, but I need to move forward and need to evolve my own style?
Yeah. I think in terms of skills, it really is being comfortable with uncertainty, ambiguity, accepting mistakes, failure, sometimes even celebrating mistakes and failure. And the reason that that's particularly important when you're focused on anything that's around social impact is because it is so much more complex than business. I still remember to this day, I was actually over in New York a few years ago because we're part of a group called Co-Impact, which is a group of education, not only education, but largely education-focused funders who all work together for impact. So it's a collaborative impact initiative. And it was actually set up with some leadership by Bill Gates. He played a fairly significant role in getting it started. Anyhow, he was being interviewed in a small panel session just in front of us. And I remember him saying that he finds, and I agree with him totally, that achieving social outcomes, social impact, is way more challenging, way more complex than achieving business objectives and business goals. He said, you can put a business plan down on a page, you can understand what levers you can pull, you can track the right metrics in order to see how things are going. And generally speaking, if you've got a good product or service that's meeting a need and it's doing so in a way that is affordable for your customers, the business will look after itself. You'll have to manage it, but it'll look after itself. When it comes to achieving social impact, the ecosystem is so complex. You think you're starting to understand it, and all of a sudden you realise that there's something that you have absolutely no understanding of whatsoever. So it's just that much more challenging and that much more complex. So you have to be able to be much more comfortable to live with uncertainty, with ambiguity, to make decisions with inadequate information, and basically get comfortable with that. But equally, you have to be be very tolerant of failure, I think, in any leadership position, because you want to encourage the people that are part of your team to stretch themselves. And most people won't stretch themselves if they fear the consequences of failure. They'll sort of tend to retract into themselves and just sort of do what's comfortable rather than what's going to stretch them. So you need to create an environment, even more so when you're focused upon trying to have social impact rather than just business outcomes, where you encourage and accept and at times even celebrate failures, provided you learn from them.
Mark, you talked about finding purpose in what you did, and it's very clear from what you're speaking about that you were lucky enough, I think, to have that purpose in the PwC role, but also now moving over to Atlassian. And we're going to talk in a while about the Pledge 1%. The point, though, that resonated for me out of what you said is that it's okay for that purpose, I guess, to evolve, and also for our careers to evolve and change. And I think expecting that at the age of 20 or 25 or 30, just as we've got the runs on the board, perhaps with the first role or first career, that we would continue on with that is a really hard expectation we put on ourselves. So it's lovely to hear from your story that you were able to, identify the nub of the purpose and then just carry that through and now find your place at Atlassian. And then that's what I think is amazing about your story. The word brave and courageous has come up a lot through our speakers' presentations, and I think that that's just another example of having the courage to follow what you want to do, and it's okay to leave that path that we thought was one that was well formed for us, if you like. And that certainly resonates from your story.
Yep, yeah, and yeah. It's funny. I look back on it, and I sort of think now, how can you have been so fearful of this change? But at the time, it was a huge fear. And I guess now, if somebody was asking me to make some other big change, given that I sort of get so much meaning and purpose and satisfaction and delight from what I'm doing today, perhaps I'd face similar fears again. And once again, I'm sort of pretending that they wouldn't exist. But certainly, I felt them. They were very, very strong and very real. But the fact that I was able to deal with my ego, deal with my insecurities, and ultimately make the decision I did is one that I have to say, has fundamentally changed my life, and the enjoyment and the satisfaction and the purpose and the my whole attitude, not my whole attitude to life, but my whole life as a whole.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. So now, so why Atlassian? What drew you to Atlassian? Obviously, there is something very special about their culture, values, that makes them unique. I know I've been following them for a number of years, but from your perspective, why did you pick Atlassian? Or rather, maybe why did they pick you?
I think I'll start with why did I pick Atlassian? It was interesting. I was first approached by Melissa Beaumont-Lee, who was the original member of the foundation team. She's been at Atlassian now for just over 8 years, approaching 9 years, I think. And I had been a little bit of an informal mentor to Mel. We'd met through sort of social impact circles in Sydney, and I sort of just helped her as an informal mentor from time to time. And so when I was leaving PwC, I sent out the obligatory email to my network saying that, after 33 years, it's time to move on, getting ready for the next phase of my life. And Mel responded saying, Mark, what are your plans? And I went back to her and said, actually, Mel, probably take 5 or 6 months out. I'd like to do something that sort of drew upon, my whole sort of range of skills. So something ideally that sort of combines social impact, shareholder value with share value. With shared value or something along those lines. Basically something that had both commercial and social outcomes would be something that was ideal. And she came back to me and said, how about this? Which was a link to the role description of the head of the foundation. I looked at it and I responded to her with the following. I basically said, great role, Mel, but not for me. I don't want to work full time. And so, I originally said no. And then I spoke about it with my current wife, my last wife, hopefully. Shouldn't even say hopefully, definitely. And we reflected on the fact that actually the role aligns so much with who I am as a person and what drives and motivates me, that I would definitely be comfortable working 5 days a week again. And so I went back to Mel and said, actually, Mel, on reflection, I'd definitely like to sort of apply for the role. I knew a little bit about Atlassian at that stage, not massive amounts. They had actually been a client of mine in my professional client-facing role at PwC. So about 3 or 4 years earlier, I'd actually done some valuation work for Atlassian. So I had some reasonable knowledge of the business, but I didn't actually know it particularly well. But the more I researched really what Atlassian was about to a greater sort of depth, the more I realized, absolutely, the opportunity to sort of lead a team and be the custodian of what was going to be a large foundation by Australian standards, well-resourced foundation. There was also complete alignment between my personal purpose in life, which I've sort of said is to help to bring out the best in business. So, help business make the biggest contribution that it can to the world at large. That's what drives me as a person. And the Pledge 1% part of the role at Atlassian was 100% aligned. Pledge 1% is all about helping business to make the biggest contribution that it can to the world at large. So the fact that there was 100% alignment between something that I'd already decided a few years earlier was my purpose in life, just made it easy to say, yeah, I'm willing to go back full time, and and I would love to do this. So that was sort of where things were from my perspective. The culture and the values of Atlassian are to die for. So that was a no-brainer. Why me? Well, I guess probably at the end of the day, it was the fact that I was, judged to be, thankfully, somebody whose behaviours are consistent with the values of Atlassian. Because frankly, if you're not, then you don't join Atlassian. You just don't get the opportunity. So obviously, the team that interviewed me, I actually had 6 interviews. The people that interviewed me sort of came to that conclusion. And it was the blend of the commercial and social impact experience, and the fact that the 2 areas of focus of the foundation were empowering business and education, and those were 2 areas that I had, substantial experience in, meant that I just happened to, have the right combination of values and experience that meant, I was judged to be the right person for the role.
And Mark, can you share with us the overarching philosophy of Pledge 1% and that model? It's got a focus on education, but talk to us a little bit more about what it is.
Yeah, well, Pledge 1% itself isn't focused on education. Pledge 1% effectively is bringing to life the belief that you don't spend your working career as a business owner basically making a successful business, and then once you've got a successful business, you then start to think about giving back or how you can make a contribution to the world at large. It is a far better approach to actually embed that concept of social impact into the DNA of your business at the earliest possible stage. So essentially, it's frankly replicating what Scott and Mike did. Atlassian was only 2 or 3 years old when Scott and Mike, which I still find amazing and inspiring, because most young entrepreneurs are so 100% focused on their business in their first 2 or 3 years. And don't forget, we're going back 15 years or more now, when social impact, CSR, purpose, and all that sort of thing was nowhere near as prominent as it is today. But they had the perspective to sort of say back then, look, if we're successful, we're going to use 1% of all of our resources for good. And that's basically what Pledge 1% is. It's encouraging business founders to say, as we grow, as we're successful, we're going to use 1% of all of the resources of the business for good. And what does for good mean? It means different things to different people. It might be, if you're it might be an area aligned to your business activity. It might be something completely unaligned to your business activity. It might be about the environment. It might be about medical research. It might be about education. It might be about homelessness. It might be about addiction. It might be about mental health. It could be anything. It's using 1% of your resources for whatever you, as the founder, the leader and the owner of the business, and in many cases your people, decide is the best thing you can do. In our case, Scott and Mike and Mel and others basically came to the conclusion many years ago now that education was the right thing for the foundation to be focused upon, and I can talk a little bit about why that's the case, why we're so passionate about education. But that was the primary focus area, and it was actually only by chance that the Pledge 1% movement got started. Scott Farquhar met up with a woman from Salesforce, Suzanne DeBianca, who was at the time the head of Salesforce.org, and Salesforce, like Atlassian, had many years ago committed to use 1% of their resources for good. And so Scott and Suzanne were sort of sharing their experience and their stories, and that led to a question or a comment about wouldn't it be great if it was not just our 2 companies but every business that used 1% of its resources for good. And once you start having that sort of conversation, that led to the inevitable, well, somebody's got to make it happen. If not us, then who? And if not now, then when? And so on the back of that conversation, Pledge 1% was born. So Salesforce, Atlassian, a software company called Rally that has since been acquired by Computer Associates, and the Tides Foundation, which is a Californian-based philanthropic foundation, came together and created the Pledge 1% movement as a US-based global nonprofit that is all about inspiring business owners to pledge to use some combination of their equity, their profit, their time, and their product for good. and then not only to inspire them, but to provide as much support as possible to help them take those pledges and bring them to life. So the foundation then really had two areas of focus: education, which it had had from day one, and Pledge 1%, which had been something that sort of came to life on the back of that sort of, I don't know if it would be a chance meeting between Scott and Suzanne, but that meeting anyway.
So clearly when we, if anyone knows anything about Atlassian, they'll know that those company values are really, really strong. Even if you're not in Atlassian, you tend to know what it stands for. You were kind enough to share some of that with us when we spoke to you prior to this interview. What is it though about Scott and Mike's leadership that is so unique, and I guess that really helps promote those company values?
There's so much. Where do you start? I guess for me, it sort of boils down to authenticity. You know, there is nothing fake. You know, I guess when I was at PwC, I worked with maybe 3,000 companies over my 33 years at PwC, and you know, you often see, you know, initiatives that are driven top down, but they're very corporatish. They're not real. They're not earthy. They're not lived. They're talked about. They're put on posters on walls and things like that. But they're not truly authentic. Everything about Scott and Mike's leadership is absolutely from the heart, absolutely authentic. You know, you see that through some of, you know, Mike's public comments about things that he's passionate about. You see it internally within Atlassian in the values. You see it in the fact that those values are lived every single day. You know, there's literally not a day that goes by when I don't have a conversation with at least one person in Atlassian where there's a reference to one of the values in the decision making. So I assume on this session I can use the F word, but you know, one of those values is don't fuck the customer. Another one is open company, no bullshit. So you know, you'll be saying, look, in the spirit of open company, no bullshit, you know, we have to do it the following way. We have to tell all the team about it. We have to tell them early. We have to give them time to think about it or whatever. Or in the spirit of don't fuck the customer, and where the customer can be different people. You know, so if you're part of mainstream Atlassian corporate, or corporate, I guess, the customer is the people who are using the software. If you're part of the foundation team, my team, the customer will either be the non-profit partners that we are partnering with and supporting, or maybe Atlassians themselves. So there's different ways of interpreting the value. But there are so many times where somebody will say, in the spirit of whichever value, this is the way we have to go. And, you know, I just never saw or heard that in you know, other organizations that I worked with. You know, most organizations, most of their people would struggle to name the values, let alone live them on a daily basis. So that's probably one of the biggest things. Yeah, I mean, it's just that authenticity. I mean, Atlassian's full of great people as well. You know, I was blown away by the quality of the people when I first arrived. I actually felt really intimidated. You know, despite the fact that I'd been a successful partner at PwC for many years, I really felt very fearful and, you know, was suffering imposter syndrome when I first arrived at Atlassian, because suddenly I realized I was, you know, out of my comfort zone, having to prove myself again, not sure that I was up to the mark, you know, all those sorts of things. So, you know, there's some great people, and actually, you know, there's a fair bit of humility in those people as well, actually. So, despite the fact that they're incredibly talented, they're also, you know, very humble. But yeah, it for me, it all ultimately comes back to authenticity. You know, yeah, that's probably all I need to say right now.
Yeah, Mark, I think the key point there is, you know, organisations, you know, the culture they say is the DNA, but I think the example here is it's how, you know, how do you ensure that that culture is just embedded in everything people say and do? And just listening to you explain that, from the outside looking in, you go, well, that sounds amazing, but it sounds like that the organisation itself, there's a lot of accountability amongst employees as well, which is probably the the success around the organisation as well. It's not just a poster on the wall, and I'd love to see those values on a poster on the wall as well, by the way, but it's also how everyone holds each other accountable.
And people call each other out. If somebody's not living the values
Yeah.
At Atlassian, you get called out, which is great. That's a sign of the fact that they're owned by every single Atlassian, and they live by every single Atlassian, and they're protected by every single Atlassian.
And therein is the difference between a poster on the wall and actually individuals living the culture and the values. Since you joined the foundation in 2016, how has the foundation's business model evolved?
Well, we've grown pretty substantially. I guess one of the first things that I did when I joined, because we were a relatively small team at that stage. I was the fourth person in the team, and there's sort of actually now 14 of us. So just in sheer size terms, number of people terms, it's grown quite a bit. But one of the first things I wanted to do was actually sort of create a clear vision and a clear sort of strategy for the foundation to sort of live up to the expectations of the new head of the foundation. I wanted to get real clarity in what we were trying to achieve, and set that light on the hill, and then we're continually working towards it. So after doing a lot of listening to many people within Atlassian, we developed a three-pronged strategy, or a strategy that we describe as having three pillars. They are educate, enlist, and energize. So educate is all about helping to educate disadvantaged youth around the world and equip them with the skills they need for the workforce of or for the 21st century, and doing that at scale as much as possible. The enlist pillar of the strategy is all about enlisting people into the Pledge 1% movement and supporting them to bring their pledges to life. And then energize is more internally focused. That's all about creating energy, reducing friction, so that Atlassians can make the biggest contribution possible in their local communities. So every Atlassian gets a week a year of paid time to volunteer. And so a lot of work goes into trying to make sure that capacity that's been made available is used as impactfully as possible. We've grown in sophistication in the way we think about the impact that we have, particularly in the educate pillar of our strategy. These days we have a very clear theory of change. We have a two-pronged approach to education, so we're supporting initiatives that are in the field, that are on the ground in the field, that have the potential to impact 1 million lives in their own right. But we're also taking a top-down approach, and we're supporting initiatives that will fundamentally sort of change the ecosystem, change the landscape, to make it easier for those initiatives that are on the ground in the field to actually thrive. So that's definitely a more sophisticated approach than we were taking in the early days. In the early days, it was very much just those programs that were in the field, and we didn't have as much thought behind our decision making. So we've definitely been on a learning journey ourselves, and for a while we had a stated goal of helping to educate 10 million disadvantaged youth within 10 years, which was an entirely noble purpose and served as a light on the hill. It guided some of our decision making, but it actually had some very sort of negative unintended consequences as well. It sort of resulted in some of the partner organizations that we were supporting chasing scale prematurely because they knew that was something that was important to us. And so, unbeknownst to us, we were, unintentionally influencing and altering their own direction and activities in ways that were definitely flawed. So we created the situation, the circumstances that sort of distracted some of our partners from doing the things that were absolutely right. We've moved away from that 10 in 10 goal now, and there's a little bit of sort of self-serving, a self-serving element to that as well. It's all about, well, how many lives have we influenced through these other organizations, and that doesn't sit very comfortably with me or us. We want to try and make sure our thinking as much as possible is all about ultimately the organizations that we support and the beneficiaries that they're ultimately working to help. And so we've moved away from counting numbers or anything like that to focusing much more upon the impact that the individual partner organisations that we're working with are wanting to have, and not trying to set one overarching measure of our impact, and effectively sort of not necessarily forcing, but strongly encouraging the partner organisations to fit in with our way of thinking. We're changing to fit into their way of thinking. So, it's been a journey of growth and evolution for us. Not surprising, the asset base of the foundation has grown substantially. The 1% of equity is now, or the asset base of the foundation is now, I don't know what it would be exactly these days, but it'd probably be roughly $250 million. When I started, the Atlassian share price was like $24. Now it's high 100s, 190 or something. So just in terms of sheer financial resources, the foundation is now a much more substantial foundation. As a result of that, our annual grant making to our partners is much larger. We're just getting more and more sophisticated as time passes in the way that we go about things, and we acknowledge our failures. I'm sharing some of them today. Happy to do that, because anything that anybody can learn from our failures is a good thing. So yeah, it's just a continual growth and a continual openness to question why we're doing what we're doing, and is there a better way, and are we having the impact that we think we're having, or are we having any negative unintended consequences?
And just building on that, your explanation around the business model, what you kindly introduced us to Joshua Ross of Humanities, who we're interviewing as part of Impactology Live. Can you share with us the unique partnership that Atlassian Foundation has with Humanities, but also with Room to Read as well, which is headed up by a former Microsoft executive, John Wood. Can you share with us sort of that arrangement and why it's so unique in the sector?
Well, essentially, I'll start with Humanities. I think Humanities will be one of the most impactful, organisations out there. It's a non-profit. It's a tech non-profit. And Josh and Adam, the two co-founders, are two of the most inspiring, relatively young Aussies you could possibly hope to meet. If one day one or both of them aren't, Australian of the Year, then we'll have some very good other candidates, because these guys are literally in that tier. But essentially, they said, look, how do we actually address the issue that the scarcest resource when it comes to changing people's lives through education is actually the money that's invested. If you have to think about the single greatest impediment and constraint on the impact that most people want to have, it's the resource that can be thrown at the problem. So they said, well, look, isn't there a better way? Isn't there a new way of conducting business, whereby all of the profits that will be generated by the business are used to tackle some social problem? And they thought, actually, there's got to be a way of doing that. And so they essentially set up Humanities as a ticketing platform. It's a direct competitor to Eventbrite. But whereas Eventbrite is, all of the profits from Eventbrite are going towards for the financial benefit of the shareholders of Eventbrite, all the profits from Humanities are being directed towards education projects around the world. And so it's a social enterprise that is looking to create a growing, sustainable, perpetual income stream to fund one of the most important things you could possibly be funding, education. But it is a non-profit, and so it can't attract capital in the traditional sense that a for-profit would attract capital, and investors would expect to get a return on their investment, financial return on their investment. So they were reliant upon philanthropy and donations to get started. Because they weren't a traditional way of tackling education, we didn't at first sort of think very consciously about them being a potential partner and a really impactful approach. But they approached us and said, look, you guys have said you're interested in impact investment. Is there a way you can view us through an impact investment lens? And I sort of somewhat naively said, well, look, you're a non-profit, so we can't get a commercial return by investing in you. The only thing that I could think of doing would be lending you money earning some interest on it, and obviously there's social impact and financial return that would come from that sort of structure. But that was the limit of my creativity. And Josh and Adam, sort of to their credit, said, look, we don't want to be taking on debt. That would put the business in too much of a sort of weak financial position. How about you donate to us, and we in turn donate to Room to Read from the profits that we generate? Because if we were a commercial investment on your part, we'd return the funds to you in the form of a commercial return, and then you'd donate to Room to Read. Why don't we just cut out the middleman, and you give us the funding to help us make Humanities successful, and we'll become a supporter of Room to Read as well, because we know there's such an effective, impactful organisation. And suddenly we thought, yeah, you're right. We can look at this in terms of an impact investment without the financial return coming to us, with effectively the financial return going ultimately to the organisation or organisations that we're supporting. So it was sort of Josh's creativity that opened our mind to the fact that through an impact investing lens we could start to support Humanities. Well, that was approaching 3 years ago now, I guess. And we have been so impressed, so blown away by every aspect of those guys and their team and their operations, their ability to sort of operate on the smell of an oily rag, over deliver pretty much every time. That we are now just a straight traditional funder of Humanities as well, and we're funding their expansion into the US market. But for me, it's a fantastic example of two young Aussies who are devoting their lives to making the world a better place, and thinking outside the box. And all success to them, because the more successful Humanities is, the more kids around the world who would otherwise be missing out on a decent education who will actually be getting a decent education. So it's a great story. The history with Room to Read goes back much further. I don't know whether it was Mike or Scott or both of them, but one of them had cause to sort of learn about John Wood. And John, as you mentioned earlier, George was a former Microsoft executive. And to cut a long story short, he left Microsoft to set up Room to Read. And Mike and Scott had read the book that John had published about his life journey and the move from Microsoft to establish Room to Read. And they were inspired. And so, and this is going back many, many years, they reached out to John and said, look, we're just this little Aussie tech company. And at that stage, they really were a little Aussie tech company. We were a little Aussie tech company. And they said, look, we're going to try this new initiative. We're going to introduce what we refer to as a starter license, which was a license for up to 10 users. And we don't know how many licenses will be issued, but whatever revenue we get from them, they'll be priced cheaply. Whatever revenue we get from them, we're going to donate to Room to Read. And Room to Read said, oh, well, that's very nice, on your way. You do it, and tell us how you get on. That became a huge, huge success, has resulted in many millions of dollars being donated to Room to Read subsequently. We've been supporting Room to Read now for 11, 12 years, something like that. Well into the teens, probably high teens in terms of millions of dollars that have flown to Room to Read. And it all came from Scott and Mike saying, wouldn't it be great to trial a new product and donate all the revenue we get from this new product to this really worthy initiative. And so again, our relationship with Room to Read has evolved over time, and it's more sophisticated, more complex these days. But it was trialing a new idea, testing it out. Might have failed, wouldn't have been a problem, but as it turned out, it became a massive source of funding over the longer term.
So it's a great story of that partnership, I guess, between two businesses, and when you've got that alignment of purpose, what you can do with that, which obviously these two organisations have. Mark, we've developed a customary practice, if you like, here at Impactology Live. We finish all of our interviews with 2 questions, and so I'll launch into those right now. The first one is, if you're on a video call with your 18-year-old self, what advice would you give to 18-year-old Mark?
It would be something about, it'd be in line with the comments I made at the start of this conversation around follow the things that excite you, that motivate you, that you find you have passion for, If you do that, you will create new opportunities that will allow you to go further in directions that excite you and motivate you and give you inspiration and give you a fulfilled life. It's easy potentially to take a traditional compromise type approach to decision making and just going down the easy path. But my advice to my younger self would be, the earlier that you can start to consciously try to invest your time and emotional energy into the things that excite you, the better your life will be, and probably the more impact that you'll have.
Wonderful. And then the last one is a game of word association. So I'm going to call out a word, and if you could just throw straight back the first word that comes into your mind. Ready to play?
I guess so.
Okay. First one, surprise, surprise, impact.
Complexity.
Atlassian.
Awesome.
Silicon Valley.
Big.
The non-for-profit sector.
Complex.
Scott Farquhar.
Inspiring.
Mike Cannon-Brooks.
Out there.
2021.
Uncertain.
Mark Redding, thank you very, very much for joining us on Impactology Live. We really appreciate your time and your story and your journey today. So thank you very, very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you.
In approximately 8 minutes, we have our next guest joining us, and this one's a very special one for both George and I. It's Dimitra Manis, who is the Chief People Officer at S&P Global. We've both had the pleasure of working with Dimitra previously, and we can't wait for her to share her impact story. See you soon.